Welcome to BBTV Intelligence Briefing. Today's question: if America went to war tomorrow, how would its army actually get there? The answer isn't a plane, and the ships that are supposed to carry it aren't ready. A soldier can get to a war zone in about 10 hours, strap into a military transport, cross an ocean, land by dinner. His equipment can't. 90% of everything the US military needs to fight a war overseas, tanks, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, doesn't fly. It sails. And the fleet that's supposed to carry it spends most of its life not sailing at all, sitting in reduced operating status, waiting for a call that assumes it'll be ready when it comes. In 2018, the government decided to test that assumption. No warning, no advance notice to the crews. They called it a turbo activation. Order the reserve Sealift fleet to get underway right now and see what actually happens. Just over 40% of the ships tested were fully ready. By the end of this briefing, you'll understand why that number isn't a maintenance failure. It's the predictable result of how America has funded its logistics for 80 years, and why no amount of shipbuilding money fixes the part of this problem that isn't about ships at all. So here's the actual system. The Department of Defense doesn't own most of its wartime shipping. It leases the option to use it. The core of that option is the Ready Reserve Force, a fleet of roughly 60 ships, mostly decades old, kept in low crew, reduced operating status at ports around the country. In peacetime, they sit. In a crisis, they're supposed to activate within 4, 5, 10, or 20 days, depending on their readiness tier, take on a skeleton crew, and sail. That 2018 turbo activation tested 61 of them with zero notice. 22 couldn't leave the dock or couldn't sail a real distance once they did. The Pentagon's own Inspector General later found something worse. The agency responsible for tracking this readiness had never verified whether its own contractors were reporting it accurately. Commanders were planning around numbers nobody had actually checked. The fastest ships in that fleet, a handful of fast Sealift ships converted decades ago from commercial tankers, can outrun almost anything else afloat, built specifically to move an armored brigade in a hurry. But speed doesn't help if the ship can't leave the pier. And most of the fleet isn't those fast ships. It's slower, older large medium-speed, roll-on roll-off vessels, sitting in a readiness tier that assumes weeks of warning before anyone needs them at all. This is where it gets structural. 90% of everything the Department of Defense moves overseas in a major conflict travels on ships like these. Not 90% of the headlines, 90% of the tonnage. The part of the war machine that gets almost none of the attention is the part everything else depends on. This gap didn't appear overnight. It's the residue of choices going back to World War II. That war was won, in large part, on shipbuilding. American shipyards built Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Over 2,700 of them in under 4 years. An industrial base built specifically because the nation needed to move armies across 2 oceans at once. That industrial base didn't survive the peace. Commercial shipbuilding is capital-intensive and slow to pay off. And once the wartime demand disappeared, American shipyards couldn't compete on cost with the rest of the world. Congress tried to preserve some Sealift capacity anyway, laying up surplus ships in what became the National Defense Reserve Fleet, the ancestor of today's Ready Reserve Force, essentially mothballing a hedge against a war nobody could predict the shape of. The legal architecture around it dates back even further, to the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which first tied a healthy commercial shipping industry to national defense as a matter of law. The idea was sound. Keep a civilian merchant fleet strong enough in peacetime that it could be requisitioned in war. But a law can preserve an obligation. It can't preserve an industry against decades of cheaper foreign competition. Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1990 and 91 became the real test. It worked. The fleet delivered the force, but it took months, not days, and it exposed just how thin the readiness margin actually was even then, over 3 decades ago. Studies after that war became the direct justification for buying the fast Sealift ships still in service today. Every year since, the same trade-off has repeated. Peacetime budgets fund the ships people can see: carriers, destroyers, fighters. The unglamorous fleet that has to be ready on a moment's notice but produces nothing visible until the moment it's needed keeps losing that argument. Here's the part most coverage of this story misses. An unready Sealift fleet isn't really a shipbuilding problem. It's an incentives problem wearing a shipbuilding costume. A warship gets funded because it's visible, deployable, and photographs well at a commissioning ceremony. A reserve cargo ship sitting at a pier in Beaumont, Texas, doing nothing for years at a time, is a much harder line item to defend in a budget hearing, even though its entire purpose is to do nothing until the one day it has to do everything. That mismatch shapes everything downstream. Maintenance gets deferred on ships that aren't being used. Crewing budgets get trimmed because reserve status ships don't need full crews until the day they suddenly do, and there's nobody qualified available to hire. Readiness reporting becomes a box to check rather than a number anyone stakes a career on, which is exactly how the Pentagon's own auditors found unverified reports flowing up the chain for years. None of this is any single person's failure. It's what happens when a system's entire value is contingent, worth everything in a crisis, worth nothing on a peacetime spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet gets reviewed every year, while the crisis might not arrive for 20. There's a simpler version of this same incentive problem. Nobody gets promoted for a ship that sailed successfully in a test nobody outside the Pentagon heard about. Somebody does get blamed if a shipbuilding program runs over budget in a public hearing. Those two facts alone push money toward what's visible and away from what's merely essential. The strategic risk isn't hypothetical. Every American war plan for a major overseas conflict assumes this fleet shows up on schedule. The plan doesn't ask what happens if 40% of it doesn't. This is where it gets interesting. The part that connects ships to people, to money, to geopolitics. Ships. Much of the ready reserve force is decades old. Some hulls originally built as commercial tankers or container ships in the 1970s and 80s before being converted for military use. Keeping 40 and 50-year-old ships combat-ready isn't like maintaining a modern warship with a dedicated industrial base behind it. Parts are scarce. Expertise is scarcer. People. Even a fully repaired fleet needs mariners to crew it, and the United States doesn't have enough of them. The Navy has estimated it's short well over 1,000 qualified merchant mariners relative to what a real mobilization would require. The average U.S. mariner is now in his late 40s, and becoming one takes years of licensing and sea time. You cannot manufacture an experienced mariner the way you can expedite a contract. Military Sealift Command has laid up ships not because the ships were broken, but because there was nobody licensed to sail them. Industry. This is the part that should actually worry you. The commercial shipbuilding base that could someday replace this aging fleet has almost disappeared. By recent estimates, China's shipbuilding capacity outweighs America's by more than 200 times over. In a single recent year, China built over 1,000 commercial vessels. The United States built 8. That gap isn't just about who wins a trade dispute. It's about which country could actually replace a lost or damaged ship mid-conflict, and which country would simply have to do without. Economics. None of this is a mystery to the people who track it. The Congressional Budget Office estimates fixing America's naval shipbuilding trajectory over the next 30 years will cost over $1 trillion, requiring tens of billions in new spending every single year. A scale of investment that has never once in the history of this problem survived contact with a peacetime budget cycle. This is the hidden system, not a broken fleet, but 4 decades of a nation choosing not to pay for something it hopes it will never need. This isn't just a logistics story, it's a deterrence story. A military whose adversaries know can't reliably move its force on schedule is a military whose threats carry less weight in every negotiation long before a single shot is fired. Washington isn't ignoring this. New workforce funding for shipbuilding was announced at the start of this year. A national defense industrial strategy now explicitly names the Sealift gap as a priority. But the numbers involved: billions annually, a merchant mariner pipeline that takes years to rebuild, a shipbuilding industrial base that takes a generation to reconstitute, mean any real fix is measured in decades, not budget cycles. Meanwhile, the readiness clock doesn't pause for the rebuilding effort. Every year the fleet ages further before its replacement arrives is a year the gap between America's war plans and America's actual capacity quietly widens. Compare that timeline to the scenario planners actually worry about most. A fast-moving contingency in the Western Pacific, thousands of miles from the nearest American port, where the difference between a force arriving in days versus weeks could decide the outcome before Washington finishes debating the budget that was supposed to prevent this exact gap. What's certain is this: the ships that would carry an American army to its next major war are right now sitting at anchor, waiting on a level of national attention that a warship gets automatically and a cargo ship never has. America doesn't lose a war because its soldiers can't fight. It risks losing one because its army can't arrive on time, and the fleet meant to get it there has been waiting for a budget line since before most of its own crew were born. This has been BBTV Intelligence Briefing. Stay sharp.